Chosen one, stop breathing like this moment is an accident. What you are feeling right now, that tearing sensation, that sense that your life is being pulled apart at the seams, is not chaos losing control. It is order reasserting itself. You were not drifting off course. You were being removed on purpose. The job didn't fall apart by mistake. The relationship didn't end because you failed. The ground didn't shift because you were weak. It shifted because where you were standing could no longer hold who you are becoming. I need you to hear this slowly. Disruption is not punishment, it is recalibration. You are not being dismantled. You are being lifted out of a configuration that capped your growth, dulled your awareness, and slowly trained you to survive instead of ascend. That pressure you feel in your chest, that strange mix of grief and anticipation, that exhaustion paired with a quiet knowing, that is not confusion. That is transition. This is what happens when the familiar can no longer contain the future forming inside you. This is what it feels like when life refuses to let you shrink back into comfort just to feel safe. You were allowed comfort for a season, not as a destination, but as a staging ground. And now the stage is being cleared. That's why everything feels louder. That's why silence feels heavier. That's why your old motivations no longer work. You are crossing from maintenance into meaning. Don't rush to fix what was broken. Some things shattered because they were never meant to follow you upward. You are not surviving disruption. You are being summoned through it. And whether you resist or remember, the elevation has already begun. You heard it at the end. The elevation has already begun. And that's why what you lost did not ask for your permission before it left. Because if life had waited for your readiness, you would have negotiated your own confinement. You would have stayed loyal to what felt stable even as it slowly starved you of range. That job didn't disappear because you lacked value. It vanished because it trained you to trade your time for tolerance, not authority. That relationship didn't end because you weren't enough. It collapsed because it required you to keep shrinking your truth to preserve peace. That move you didn't plan, that displacement you resisted, that sudden reroute you still replay in your mind, none of it was random. It was removal. Chosen one, comfort is not neutral. It conditions you. It teaches you how to survive without questioning why you feel underused, unseen, or quietly restless at night. It rewards consistency while quietly punishing expansion. And when someone is marked for elevation, comfort becomes dangerous. So life intervenes, not gently, precisely. Notice how the disruption targeted the very structures you relied on most. Income, identity, attachment, location. Those weren't coincidences. Those were load-bearing illusions. They held you up, yes, but they also held you down. You didn't just lose something. You were released from a ceiling you had learned to call a roof. That's why the loss felt disproportionate. Because it wasn't about the thing itself. It was about the version of you that could never rise while tied to it. You didn't outgrow it gradually. You were uprooted abruptly. Because gradual change gives fear too much time to renegotiate. You would have talked yourself out of the very future that now feels frightening and inevitable. You would have chosen familiarity over alignment and called it wisdom. So the recalibration bypassed your logic. It went straight for the foundation. And now you're standing in the aftermath, asking why everything that once made sense suddenly feels inaccessible, irrelevant, or heavy to imagine returning to. That's not grief alone. That's misalignment being exposed. Your nervous system is recalibrating. Your identity is shedding borrowed definitions. Your ambition is being purified from survival goals into something sharper, quieter, more sovereign. This is why going back feels impossible even when forward feels unclear. You weren't meant to circle back. You were meant to be rerouted, and rerouting always feels like loss before it feels like lift. Because elevation requires leverage, and leverage requires separation. Life had to separate you from the people who only knew the compliant version of you. From the roles that rewarded endurance but never invited leadership. From the environments that normalized your diminishment. Not because they were evil, but because they were incompatible with where you're being placed. Chosen one, when recalibration begins, everything that cannot rise with you will resist you. And when resistance fails, it will release you. That release is not rejection, it is clearance. You are not being emptied, you are being unburdened. And what remains after disruption is not nothing, it is space. Space for capacity you haven't used yet. Space for authority you haven't embodied yet. Space for a life that requires you to stand taller than comfort ever allowed. The ground didn't betray you. It gave way because higher ground demands lighter attachments. Notice what you're standing in now. Space. That emptiness you were just left with is not a void. It's a pattern revealing itself. Because this wasn't the first time life shook your foundations. It just felt like the most personal. Look back carefully, not sentimentally, pattern-wise. Every major expansion in your life was preceded by a loss you didn't choose. A door closing without explanation. A role ending before you felt finished. A separation that arrived before closure. You didn't stumble into those moments, you were escorted into them. That's why calling it bad luck never quite fit. Bad luck is random. This was targeted. Others around you experienced the same environments, the same economy, the same season, yet their structures remained intact while yours collapsed. Not because you were weaker, because you were carrying more. Chosen one's systems break first around those meant to outgrow them. This is the part few people tell you. When you're marked for elevation, stagnation feels like suffocation, and life responds to suffocation with force. Think of the people you admire most, the ones whose impact now feels obvious, inevitable even. Their stories don't begin with smooth ascent. They begin with exile. They were fired before they were seen, discarded before they were refined, misunderstood before they were trusted, not once, repeatedly. That repetition is the signature. It's the cycle of removal, pressure, emergence. Removal, pressure, emergence. Every time the disruption stripped away what no longer fit. Every time the pressure revealed capacity they didn't know how to access voluntarily. Every time the emergence placed them somewhere they could not have reached intact. That's not coincidence. That's orchestration. You weren't unlucky to lose early. You were spared the decay of staying too long. Some people are allowed to remain comfortable because comfort is all they're meant to steward. Others are interrupted because their assignment demands elasticity, vision, and endurance. You belong to the second category. That's why your life doesn't move in straight lines. It moves in leaps, ruptures, and sudden reroutes. Linear growth would have bored you into compliance. Incremental progress would have taught you to settle. So your evolution arrives in shocks, and each shock removes another illusion. That stability equals safety. That approval equals alignment. That endurance equals purpose. Chosen one, if your life were truly random, the chaos would scatter you. Instead, it keeps repositioning you closer to yourself. Different city, different circle, different scale of responsibility, same inner knowing, stronger each time. This is why you keep ending up in unfamiliar territory with familiar pressure. It's not because you didn't learn the lesson. It's because the lesson scales with the calling. You are not repeating cycles. You are ascending spirals. Each disruption lifts you higher, even while it disorients you temporarily. Each loss removes a lower ceiling, even while it leaves you exposed to open sky. Bad luck traps people. This keeps moving you. And movement, even when violent, is a sign of life preparing you for altitude. You ended the last moment seeing it clearly. This wasn't randomness. It was movement. And here is where the discomfort sharpens. Because once you recognize the pattern, you're forced to confront the lie you've been telling yourself to survive it, that something went wrong. You tried to make sense of the pain by calling it failure. You labeled the interruption as punishment because that was easier than believing it was precise. But hear this, chosen one. Punishment breaks people down without direction. This broke you open with intent. If this were discipline, it would have crushed your vision. Instead, it stripped away what distracted it. Notice what didn't leave when everything else did. Your awareness stayed. Your hunger stayed. That quiet pull towards something more stayed. That's not accidental. What left were structures that insulated you from your own depth. What collapsed were routines that numbed the urgency of your becoming. What fell away were roles that kept you busy but not aligned. You weren't being corrected. You were being repositioned. Because where you were headed could not be reached with the weight you were carrying. This is the part people resist. Not the pain, but the implication. If this was orchestration, then returning to what was lost is not healing. It's regression. And that terrifies the part of you that equates familiarity with safety. So you wrestle. You replay conversations. You imagine alternate outcomes. You bargain with memory, not because you want the past, but because surrender feels like standing still while everything inside you changes shape. Chosen one resistance is understandable, but it is not neutral. The longer you frame this as something to recover from, instead of something to rise through, the more energy you spend trying to reassemble a life that was never meant to elevate you. Protection often arrives disguised as loss, especially when the danger was subtle. You weren't being attacked. You were being removed before stagnation calcified into identity. Some doors close because they are unsafe. Others close because they are too small. And the most painful closures are the ones that still look functional from the outside. That's why this disruption cut deep. It didn't look like destruction. It looked like you being left behind. But you weren't abandoned. You were advanced. The real conflict now is not whether you were hurt, you were. The conflict is whether you will keep interpreting protection as rejection. Because the moment you do, you'll try to prove your worth to spaces that were never meant to witness your authority. And the moment you don't, something shifts. The loss stops feeling like a verdict. It starts feeling like clearance. Not everything that leaves you is taken. Some things are removed because you're about to be trusted with more. And more requires room. You felt it at the end. Room. That space wasn't created to keep you safe. It was created to make growth unavoidable. Because comfort is not rest. Comfort is containment. It rewards predictability. It trains you to confuse peace with the absence of pressure. And slowly, almost politely, it teaches you to lower your expectations of yourself. Chosen one, nothing powerful emerges from ease. It emerges from friction. That's why disruption doesn't negotiate. It interrupts. When comfort has done its job, it becomes a ceiling. And ceilings are dangerous to those carrying expansion inside them. You weren't losing stability. You were losing sedation. That's why in the aftermath, your mind feels sharper and more exhausted at the same time. That's why your old routines feel hollow. That's why distractions no longer work the way they used to. The fire has been lit. Disruption forces questions comfort never asks. Who are you without the role? Who are you without the approval? Who are you without the structure telling you when to feel useful? These questions feel cruel at first, but they are the birthplace of authority, because authority is not given to the comfortable. It is entrusted to the awake. Comfort dulls hunger. Disruption clarifies it. That's why this season feels intense even when nothing is visibly happening. Your internal architecture is being rewritten. Old coping mechanisms fail. Old goals feel insufficient. Old versions of success no longer satisfy. This is not instability. This is evolution in progress. Look at what pressure is doing. It's revealing how much more you can carry without collapsing. It's forcing you to develop discernment instead of dependence. It's training you to self-regulate instead of self-abandon. Comfort never taught you that. Chosen one, if growth could happen without disruption, you would have already arrived. But arrival requires capacity, and capacity is forged, not granted. That's why the pressure keeps increasing until you either expand or retreat, and retreat is no longer an option that brings relief. You've tasted awareness now. You've seen the pattern. You know comfort would cost you more than the disruption ever did. So the fire stays lit, not to destroy you, but to shape you into someone who can stand at a higher altitude without losing themselves. Comfort would have kept you contained. Disruption is teaching you how to rise. The fire is already burning. You can feel it. And now comes the part no one prepares you for. Because once comfort is gone, the real work begins inside you. You're not just adapting to new circumstances, you're shedding an old operating system. That's why your emotions feel louder. That's why your instincts feel unfamiliar but sharper. That's why you can no longer ignore misalignment without physical resistance. This is not instability. This is recalibration reaching your core. Pressure exposes what was borrowed, what was performative, what was learned just to survive, and it leaves behind what is native. Chosen one, this is where identity starts to crack, not to destroy you, but to free you from definitions that were never authored by you. You notice it in how you speak now, less explaining, less apologizing. You notice it in what you tolerate. What once felt normal now feels invasive. What once felt exciting now feels hollow. That's not arrogance. That's alignment sharpening. Disruption forces you to meet yourself without mirrors. without applause, without roles reflecting you back. And in that silence, something steadier forms. Self-trust. Not confidence, not bravado. Trust. The kind that doesn't need consensus to move. The kind that can hold uncertainty without collapsing into urgency. This is why you feel slower and faster at the same time. Slower to react, faster to recognize truth. Your perception is changing. You see patterns others miss. You feel undercurrents others deny. You sense when something is misaligned long before it breaks. That sensitivity is not fragility, it's instrumentation. And now it's being tuned. Externally, life mirrors this shift. People respond to you differently. Some lean in, some pull away. Not because you change personalities, but because you stop broadcasting availability for misuse. Boundaries form naturally when identity stabilizes. You no longer have to enforce them loudly. Your presence does the work. Chosen one authority does not arrive with permission. It arrives when your inner world becomes congruent enough to hold it. Disruption accelerates that congruence. It strips away the need to be understood. It replaces it with the capacity to be effective. And effectiveness requires precision. That's what pressure is giving you. Precision in thought, precision in choice, precision in self-recognition. This is the forging phase. The part where you stop asking who you are becoming and start noticing who you can no longer pretend to be. You can feel it now. You are no longer becoming. You are crossing. What cracked inside you in the last section wasn't personal. It was archetypal. Because long before your story had a name, this pattern existed. Nothing that carries weight is built without demolition first. Nothing that endures is formed without fire. Civilizations rise only after old systems collapse. Forests regenerate only after burning clears what choked new growth. Even the body rebuilds itself by breaking down what no longer serves it. Creation has always required destruction, not chaos, sequence. And now that sequence has reached you. Chosen one, this is why the disruption felt excessive. Because it wasn't just changing circumstances, it was ending an era. You weren't losing a season. You were exiting a former identity. This is the threshold most people never cross. Not because it's unavailable, but because it's irreversible. Once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. Once you recognize the orchestration, you can't go back to pretending it was accidental. And that awareness carries a cost. You can no longer hide inside excuses. You can no longer blame timing, people, or luck. You can no longer wait to be rescued by familiarity, because destruction has already done its work. The old structures are gone. The old permissions revoked. The old narratives unusable. What remains is raw material, ash, silence, potential. This is the moment myths are born from, not the triumph, the aftermath, the place where nothing looks impressive yet, but everything is possible if you step forward instead of rebuilding backward. Chosen one standing here is uncomfortable because it demands a choice without guarantees. But this is also where authority is decided. Those who retreat rebuild replicas of what failed them. Those who cross allow something entirely new to emerge. And here's the truth that tightens the chest. If you were meant to return, the fire would have spared the structure. If you were meant to repeat, the collapse would have been partial. But this was total, which means the next phase cannot resemble the last. You are standing between what has already ended and what refuses to arrive until you move. This is not the end of the process, it is the point of no return. And once you cross, life will stop asking if you're ready. It will start asking if you're willing to carry what comes next. You felt the weight at the end. That tightening in the chest wasn't fear, it was recognition. Because once you cross the threshold, the question changes. Not why did this happen, but what is being asked of me now? This is where the idea of being chosen gets misunderstood. Chosen is not selected for ease. Chosen is assigned to pressure, and there are signs, not dramatic ones, consistent ones. Your life keeps placing you in situations that demand more awareness than others seem required to bring. You're asked to hold complexity while others simplify. You're forced to mature where others remain protected by denial. That's not misfortune, that's training. You notice how challenges don't arrive once. They arrive in variations. Same theme, different scale. Each time the environment changes, but the demand is familiar. Speak truth. stand alone. Choose alignment over approval. Chosen one randomness does not repeat itself with intelligence. Assignment does. Another marker. You've always felt slightly out of place even when things were going well. Not unhappy, misaligned. As if you were living in a life that fit on paper but not in your body. As if something in you refused to fully settle. That restlessness wasn't ingratitude. It was orientation. Your nervous system knew what your logic couldn't yet justify. And then there's the pull. The quiet, persistent sense that you're meant for something that hasn't revealed its shape yet. Not fantasy, not ambition, calling. It doesn't inflate your ego. It humbles you. Because the closer it gets, the more responsibility you feel pressing inward. You don't want to be seen, you want to be ready. That distinction matters. Chosen one, if this were about specialness, disruption would have rewarded you with admiration. Instead, it isolated you. It stripped you of external validation, so your inner compass could finally calibrate without interference. That's the sign few people talk about. Chosen paths are lonely before they're influential, heavy before they're rewarding, demanding long before they're affirming. And here is the clearest indicator. Despite everything you've lost, you cannot abandon this path without losing yourself. You can try, you can distract, you can delay, but the knowing remains. That knowing is not ego, it's obligation. You weren't disrupted to feel special. You were disrupted because something needs to be carried forward and you are capable of bearing it. Now the responsibility is yours, not to rush, not to perform, but to stop pretending this was random. You said it at the end without realizing it. The responsibility is yours now. And this is where the path stops being symbolic and starts being embodied. Because once you recognize that disruption was assignment, not accident, neutrality disappears. You can no longer drift. You must choose how you move through what remains. Elevation does not happen automatically after awakening. It happens through participation. This is the truth most people avoid. Being uprooted opened the door. Walking through it requires discipline. Chosen one surrender is not passivity. It is precision. It is the decision to stop fighting the shape your life is insisting on becoming. To stop using nostalgia as a bargaining chip. To stop exhausting yourself trying to recreate conditions that no longer respond to you. Surrender is not giving up agency. It is reallocating it. You stop spending energy on resistance and you redirect it into alignment. This is where emotional processing becomes non-negotiable. Disruption didn't just remove structures. It surfaced unprocessed grief, anger, fear, and identity confusion that comfort once kept buried. If you bypass this stage, elevation stalls. Not because you're unworthy, but because weight cannot be carried on fractured foundations. So you feel it fully, without dramatizing it, without weaponizing it. You allow the grief to move through you instead of crystallizing into bitterness. You let anger clarify boundaries instead of becoming identity. You sit with fear long enough to hear what it's trying to protect. This is not self-indulgence. This is maintenance of the vessel. Chosen one higher altitude demands internal regulation. What you suppress below becomes destabilizing above. That's why this phase feels slower than you want. Because depth is being built before expansion. And while emotions are being integrated, intention must be set deliberately. Not vague hope, not forced positivity, clear orientation. You decide who you are willing to be when comfort is no longer the incentive. You decide what standards you will maintain even when no one is watching. You decide what you will not compromise again, no matter how familiar the offer looks. These decisions feel small, but they are architectural. They determine the structure of what comes next. Elevation is not about avoiding challenge. It is about transforming challenge into leverage. Every obstacle now carries information. Every delay reveals refinement points. Every closed door clarifies direction instead of diminishing worth. But only if you stay conscious. This is where many retreat. They want the promise of elevation without the responsibility of embodiment. They want relief more than transformation, and life will allow that choice, briefly. But you already know retreat will not bring peace. It will bring numbness. Chosen one participation means showing up differently now. You listen more carefully, you speak more selectively, You move with intention rather than urgency. You don't rush to replace what was lost. You allow space to educate you, because silence sharpens discernment, and discernment becomes your primary currency. You start recognizing which opportunities align with expansion and which simply soothe anxiety. You notice when something excites your ego but drains your integrity. You feel when a path requires you to shrink again, even if it promises security. This is the blueprint activating, not a map, a way of perceiving, and it demands consistency. Elevation is sustained by daily alignment, not dramatic moments. By quiet refusals, by unseen commitments, by choosing congruence even when no immediate reward appears. This is where material and spiritual ascent begin to converge. Because as your internal world stabilizes, your external reality responds. Not instantly, but inevitably. Authority attracts provision, clarity attracts opportunity, integrity attracts trust, not because you chase them, but because you become compatible with them. Chosen one, the cost of elevation is responsibility for your own becoming. No one else can do this part for you. No belief system can bypass it. No affirmation can replace it. You must live in a way that honors the disruption that made room for you. And once you do, there is no going back to smaller assignments without inner collapse. Because the blueprint is active now, and it responds only to embodiment. You can feel it now, the point of no return. What you activated in the last section cannot be undone by comfort, distraction, or delay. Because once you participate consciously, elevation stops being a possibility and becomes a responsibility. This is where the narrative changes tone, not louder, clearer, because the elevated reality is not fantasy, it is consequence. Chosen one elevation is not about receiving more, it is about being entrusted with more. And trust follows capacity, not desire. That's why the disruption had to come first, because what's coming next would have crushed the version of you that relied on familiarity, validation, or external structure to feel grounded. The new paradigm you're stepping into demands self-governance. You will notice it subtly at first. Opportunities appear that require discernment instead of excitement. Relationships shift toward depth instead of proximity. Provision arrives tied to responsibility rather than relief. Nothing about this phase is accidental. You are no longer being tested to see if you can rise. You are being observed to see how you carry what you've been given. This is where many misunderstand elevation. They expect constant expansion, constant affirmation, constant evidence that they are on the right path. But elevation is quieter than that. It stabilizes. You begin to experience a strange steadiness where chaos once lived. Not because life becomes easy, but because you are no longer internally fragmented by every external shift. You don't panic the way you used to. You don't chase the way you used to. You don't cling the way you used to. Because identity has anchored, and anchored people move differently. You'll feel it when pressure comes again, because it will. But this time it won't uproot you. It will confirm you. You will recognize challenges not as threats to your worth, but as requests for your leadership. Requests to apply what was forged in you during the disruption. This is the real reward. Not abundance as excess, but abundance as circulation. Resources move through you because you are no longer trying to hoard security. Influence grows because you are no longer seeking approval. People listen because you speak from coherence, not hunger. Chosen one, the elevated reality is one where your presence carries weight without force, where your words land because they are aligned, where your boundaries hold because they are embodied. And here is the part few expect. Elevation will require restraint. You will have access to things you once begged for, platforms, connections, opportunities, but not all of them will be yours to take. Discernment becomes more important than ambition, because misuse at higher levels creates deeper collapse. That's why responsibility intensifies alongside blessing. You'll feel it when you're tempted to compromise for speed, when shortcuts present themselves dressed as efficiency, when old patterns whisper that no one would notice. But you will notice, because your integrity is no longer theoretical, it's structural. Violating it would destabilize everything you've built internally, and you won't be willing to pay that price again. The elevated reality is not constant ascent, it is sustained congruence. A life where your inner world and outer world finally speak the same language, where your work reflects your values, where your relationships respect your boundaries, where your time is invested, not spent escaping. Chosen one, this is why the disruption had to be thorough. Partial collapse would have produced partial transformation. Selective loss would have left hidden fractures, but you are being positioned for impact that requires wholeness. Impact doesn't always look dramatic. Often it looks like consistency, showing up grounded, making decisions without panic, carrying pressure without projecting it onto others. People will feel safer around you without knowing why. Systems will respond to you differently without explanation. Not because you demand authority, but because you embody it. This is stewardship, the ability to hold influence, resources, and responsibility without being consumed by them. And stewardship always follows refinement. That's why this elevation doesn't inflate you, it humbles you, because you understand what it cost. You remember the nights of uncertainty, the moments of isolation, the temptation to go back just to feel held. You don't forget the ash, and because you remember, you don't waste what rises from it. Chosen one, your past disruption now becomes a reference point, not a wound. You draw wisdom from it, discernment from it, compassion from it, not pity, clarity. And that clarity shapes how you lead, how you love, how you choose. This is the elevated paradigm, a life where nothing is random anymore, where even setbacks arrive as data, not verdicts, where silence instructs instead of threatens. You no longer ask, why is this happening to me? You ask, what is this asking of me now? And you answer with action, not frantic action, aligned action. Because you know, rushing is a sign of fear, not faith. Chosen one, this is what the uprooting was for. Not to destroy your life, but to prepare you to carry one that would otherwise have overwhelmed you. Elevation doesn't mean you escape responsibility. It means you finally become capable of holding it without losing yourself. And now, whether you feel ready or not, you are standing in the reality that disruption was building toward all along. This is not the end of the journey. It is the beginning of stewardship, and it requires everything you have become. You are here now, not arriving. Arrived, and the quiet you feel is not emptiness. It is alignment settling into place. Everything that needed to be shaken has already fallen. Everything that needed to be burned has already turned to ash. What remains is not fragile, it is deliberate. Chosen one, this is the moment most people rush past. They mistake stillness for stagnation. They confuse calm with absence. But this pause is sacred. It is the space where elevation integrates into your nervous system, where responsibility becomes natural instead of heavy, where your life stops feeling like a reaction and starts feeling like a response. You are not waiting for the next sign. You are becoming the signal. That's why there is less noise now, why the urgency has softened, why you no longer feel the need to explain yourself to rooms that cannot hold your truth. You have crossed the season of proving. What comes next will not announce itself with disruption. It will arrive through consistency, through patterns that stabilize instead of explode, through opportunities that require discernment more than bravery. And you will recognize them not because they are loud, but because they do not demand that you abandon yourself to accept them. Chosen one, remember this. Elevation does not always feel like rising. Sometimes it feels like grounding, like finally standing still without fear of being left behind. Like knowing you could move if you wanted to, but choosing not to rush because clarity has replaced anxiety. This is the fruit of recalibration. The uprooting did not make you harder, it made you clearer. You see what costs too much now. You feel what drains instead of feeds. You sense when something is misaligned long before it collapses. That is not caution, that is wisdom earned, and wisdom carries responsibility. Not to be perfect, not to be visible, but to be honest in how you move forward. You will be tempted at times to romanticize the struggle you survived, to identify with disruption because it once defined you. Do not do that. The fire was a season, not a home. The ash was fertilizer, not identity. You are allowed to live without constant proving now. Let peace feel unfamiliar without sabotaging it. Let stability arrive without suspicion. Let your life expand quietly without spectacle. Chosen one, the truest sign of elevation is not intensity, it is integrity. When your inner world and outer actions stop contradicting each other. When your choices no longer require self-betrayal to sustain. When your days reflect who you are, not who you are trying to become. This is not the end of your growth, but it is the end of being torn apart to force it. From here on, expansion comes through embodiment, through daily alignment, through honoring what you learned when everything fell away. And if pressure returns, you will not panic. You will recognize it as refinement, not rejection. You will meet it with steadiness instead of fear, because you know now. Nothing that truly belongs to you can be taken by disruption, and nothing that limits your elevation can stay once you are ready to carry more. You were not uprooted to wander endlessly. You were uprooted to be replanted at the right depth in the right soil with the right capacity to grow without breaking. Stand there, not rushing, not retreating, just rooted in who you have become.